Lindsey M. Burke is Director for the Center of Education for Policy and the Will Skillman Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. She received her BA from Holland University and an MA from the University of Virginia. Ms. Burke is currently a PhD candidate in education policy at George Mason University. She is the recipient of the W. Glenn and Rita Ricardo Campbell Award for her work on choice in education. She has testified before Congress on education policy and has published evaluations of education choice options for public policy foundations, such as the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and EdChoice. She has done extensive work developing and evaluating education savings accounts. She has written on education reform for numerous publications, including the Washington Times, National Review, and the Detroit News. Please join me in welcoming Lindsey M. Burke to the podium.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It's really just an honor to be here at Hillsdale to speak at the Markets and Policy Seminar. It's really my pleasure. It's the first time that I've been out to Hillsdale, so it's really just a beautiful campus. The drive-in was beautiful. The leaves were changing. Everything was just gorgeous. So really, really happy to be here. So I want to take a little time today to talk a little bit about the current state of K-12 education in America, particularly how we got to where we are today with the growing, and I would say probably galloping, federal intervention in education over the past half century, and what that has meant both for K-12 education, but also I'd like to talk just a little about higher education policy as well to round it out. So first, why do we pursue education? It's a big question. What do we hope education will impart to future generations? Education is viewed as a means to achieving important ends. Education is a means for fostering upward mobility, instilling civic values, engendering an appreciation for the arts and humanities, even strengthening national security, and imparting students with the knowledge and skills necessary to pursue their life and career goals. At its essence, education is seen as the vehicle through which the individual is able to achieve his highest aspirations, and in so doing, elevates society and nudges human progress forward. Yet, progress in K-12 education and attainment has been stagnant for at least a half century. It jeopardizes the chances that public education can deliver on the expectations of the American people. A few examples. Among 8th graders, just 34% of American 8th graders are proficient in reading. That was in 2015, with proficiency rates declining significantly for Black and Hispanic students to 16% and 21% proficient, respectively. Data from the U.S. Department of Education's long-term trend assessment show that reading and mathematics achievement has largely stagnated over the past half century. In fact, reading and mathematics achievement is no better today than it was in the 1970s, when the U.S. Department of Education first began tracking those data. Suboptimal achievement and attainment are situated within decades of K-12 education reform efforts. The launch of the Sputnik satellite awakened an America that had, until that point, felt technologically superior to its Russian Cold War allies. The launch of the first Earth-orbiting satellite spurred the Eisenhower administration to pursue new federal investment in higher education in particular, resulting in the passage of the 1958 National Defense Education Act, a law intended to rectify a perceived shortage of mathematics and mathematics experts and scientists through access to federal student loans for higher education. Although the NDEA provided funding for higher education, Title II of the law also provided funding to state education agencies to increase instruction in modern foreign languages and to strengthen math and science instruction. So the NDEA really was the first considerable foray on the part of the federal government into K-12 education. And it laid the groundwork for the additional federal intervention that would come about a decade later under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. With the passage of ESEA, the federal focus quickly shifted from addressing perceived national security threats to improving educational outcomes for disadvantaged children. President Lyndon Johnson, upon signing ESEA into law, stated that his intention was, quote, to bridge the gap between helplessness and hope. So lofty, lofty aspirations in ESEA. ESEA contained provisions providing financial assistance to low-income school districts, school library resources, funding for education research, and grants to strengthen state departments of education. But it was just 32 pages long. You could get a staple through it, that original ESEA. Right, there are no federal laws that you can get a staple through today, I promise you. But after 7 reauthorizations of the original ESEA throughout the 1970s, throughout the 1980s, into the 90s, and then culminating with No Child Left Behind in 2001, and now its most recent successor, the Every Student Succeeds Act, we saw more and more federal spending added to the original ESEA to finance more and more federal programs and the labyrinth that had been created within that law. Federal intervention in education really reached a high watermark with No Child Left Behind, when for the first time, federal policymakers began dictating to states the frequency with which they would have to test children. So No Child Left Behind told states that every student, every year in grades 3 through 8, and then again in high school, would have to be tested in core subjects, and it adhered sanctions to schools that failed to make what they deemed adequate yearly progress. So it was significant new federal intervention in local school policy. But state and district level reforms actually paralleled those federal reforms over the past half century. States tried to improve academic outcomes. From the mid-20th century onward, policymakers introduced a wave of reform in the states, ebbing and flowing between policies rooted in theories of constructivism, such as the creation of open classrooms, to top-down approaches that included teacher professionalization efforts and the growth of university-based schools of education. Education reform experienced a marked shift toward outcomes-based reform during the 1980s and continuing through the 1990s. So that shift from inputs-based reform, so increased per-pupil spending, increased efforts at curriculum and instruction reform, shifted significantly to outcomes-based reform. And that was a response, largely in the 1980s, to a sense that, particularly in the wake of the 1983 Nation at Risk report, that American education was pretty mediocre. And in fact, the famous line from that report was, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we would have viewed it as an act of war. I mean, those were strong words in a federal education document. But despite these many federal and state-based education reform efforts from the mid-20th century onward, educational outcomes have remained middling, to say the least. Some scholars have noted that there has been a considerable productivity decline in America's schools. American 15-year-olds ranked 25th, 24th, and 40th in science, reading, and mathematics achievement, respectively, on the 2015 Program for International Student Assessment, the PISA exam. And that's an exam that compares outcomes among OECD countries, wealthier nations. As Stanford economist Carolyn Hoxby has found, school math productivity declined 55% between 1970 and 1998. Reading productivity declined 73% over that same time period. At the same time, though, federal, state, and local expenditures, total inflation-adjusted spending, nearly tripled per pupil during that time period, from about $4,500 in 1965, the year Johnson signed that original ESEA into law, to about $12,500 by the 2013 school year. Although differing in approach, these various reform efforts, whether federal or state level, were each designed to try to improve outcomes within a district-based system, which I think is at the core of the problem. Indeed, today, families across America have only two ways to exercise school choice. They can either be wealthy enough to pay tuition out of pocket and their local property taxes to support their district school, or they can be wealthy enough to buy a home in an affluent school district. This isn't a new phenomenon at all, but the dichotomy between the educational haves and have-nots has been magnified as Americans watch their education system leave them in the middle of the pack internationally, as they watch generations of students being left behind. I think that we should be up in arms about the fact that just a third of high school seniors graduate reading proficiently. A third. Economist Milton Friedman recognized this problem early on. He recognized the urgency of the situation all the way back in 1955 when he first proposed that the public financing of education should be separated from its delivery. He made rational, compelling arguments for why government funding of education does not necessitate government administration of schooling, and operationalized that idea in 1955 through the school voucher concept, where parents could use a voucher to pay tuition at a private school of choice. Friedman's voucher idea, though, would effectively remain an academic idea from about 1955 until 1990, when we saw the introduction of the first modern-day school choice program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee introduced the first voucher in the country, letting the choice and competition genie out of the bottle. And today, there are more than 60 private school choice programs, so vouchers, tax credit scholarships, and education savings accounts, operating in more than half of all states today. But what is remarkable to me is that Milton Friedman kept refining this voucher idea decades after he originally first conceived it. As late as 2003, he gave an interview to the journal Education Next, in which he said, "There's no reason to expect that the future market will have the shape or the form that the present market has. How do we know," he asked, "how education will develop? Why is it sensible for a child to get all of his schooling in one brick-and-mortar school? Why not let them spend part of a voucher on math in one place and part of it on English or science somewhere else? Why can't a student take lessons at home, especially now with the availability of the internet?" Friedman wondered. And that little gem that he left in that interview in Education Next laid the groundwork for a complete reconceptualization of how K-12 education is financed. It forced us to rethink at the most basic level how we fund K-12 education. And critically, it led to the introduction of education savings accounts, or ESAs. As some observers have noted, if a school voucher is similar to a coupon to pay tuition at a single private school of choice, an education savings account is like an Amazon gift card. You can still pay that private school tuition, but a student can pay for myriad ancillary education services with that debit card, that education savings account. Arizona became the first state to adopt an ESA model, and they did it back in 2011. And today, 6 states now have ESA options in place. So how does it work exactly? If you look at the Arizona model, again, they started it in 2011. An eligible student first chooses to exit the district system, the public school. The parents then receive 90% of what the state would have spent on that child in a public school, and it gets deposited directly into their education savings account. Once those funds are deposited into an ESA, goes onto a restricted use debit card, parents can then use those funds to pay for any education-related service, product, or provider. So they can pay for private school tuition, textbooks, curricular materials, private tutoring, special education services and therapies if their child needs it. They can pay for online courses. They can pay for individual courses at a public school or a public charter school. They can pay for a host of other education-related services and products and providers. But notably, and the real critical refinement from the school voucher concept, is that you can roll over unused ESA dollars year to year. So I had the chance, just to put a punctuation mark on how interesting this is, I had a chance to meet some families in Arizona who are benefiting from the ESA option. And one of those families were the Ashtons. And their son, Max Ashton, great guy, he's been blind since birth. And when the education savings account option came on board, he decided to take advantage of it. And his family, they'll tell you, they'll be the first to say the public school was working okay for Max. They didn't have major complaints, but they decided to give it a try and see how it would work. And so Max exited the public system and got his 90% of what the state would have spent on him in the public school deposited straight into his ESA. It literally goes onto a debit card that a parent controls, the state per pupil dollars. Max was then able to, which for them, since he was a blind student, was $20,000 a year. Remember, that's just 90%. So Max was then able to pay his private school tuition at Brophy Academy in Arizona, a wonderful private school, and then was able to buy everything else that he needed to be successful. All of his Braille textbooks and assistive technologies, a talking computer, everything that as a blind student he needed to support him. They were able to do all of that, and they still had thousands of dollars left over at the end of every year that they were able to roll over. Max now uses his leftover state ESA dollars to pay for his college tuition at Loyola Marymount University in California. I mean, to me, that is just an incredible way to rethink how we deliver K-12 education. It's his leftover state ESA dollars from Arizona that he is now using in California. And I think it really demonstrates how putting parents in the driver's seat of their children's education can go a really long way in ensuring that families both get a good value and get an option that works for them. So why does it work that way? Why is it so effective? Here again, I think Milton Friedman has a great answer to that. And he really had the foresight to push for parent-controlled education spending. Milton Friedman had a great framework for, in general, how one might spend money. He said there are 4 ways that you can spend money. You can spend your own money on yourself, you can spend your own money on someone else, you can spend someone else's money on yourself, or you can spend somebody else's money on somebody else. Now, you can think about how this might apply to K-12 education. Public schools spend money in that last category, category 4, Friedman called it. Public schools, by their very nature, spend somebody else's money, your taxpayer dollars, on somebody else's children. So they have very little incentive either to economize or to maximize value. Education savings accounts, while admittedly are still those public funds, get us much closer to that category 1 spending, much more like spending your own money, and it's certainly spending it on your own children. And so you have every incentive to economize and to maximize value. But education choice, of course, is about far more than economic incentives. I think the economics are very important. That 4 ways to spend money, I think, really does drive home how valuable and how economized we can make K-12 education when we put decisions in the hands of the people who are closest to the children those decisions affect. But it is about more than just economic incentives. We know that choice improves academic outcomes for both school choice participants and non-participants, and that it improves a student's chances of graduating high school. But it also increases their likelihood of attending and persisting through college. It decreases their likelihood of being involved in criminal activity, and it improves their earnings potential. And it leads to parents who are more satisfied with their child's education. In other words, the benefits of school choice accrue to some of the most important aspects of our lives. And it bears out in the research. To date, researchers have conducted 20 randomized control trial evaluations of the impact of school choice on academic achievement and attainment. Among the RCTs conducted to date, 17 of those have studied the impact of school choice on academic achievement. And of course, randomized control trials are important. They are the gold standard for assessing the impact of many interventions, certainly education interventions, since chance determines which students receive access to a given intervention, in this case, school choice. Among the 17 randomized control trial evaluations that are out there examining the impact of school choice on academic achievement, 11 of those 17 have found positive impacts for some or for all students on academic achievement. 4 of those evaluations found null effects, so no impact as a result of access to choice, such as a school voucher option, and then 2 have actually found negative effects as a result of access to a school voucher option. We could talk a lot about why that might be the case, but the evidence suggests it was the unique regulatory environments in which these school voucher options were operating that may have caused the negative effects to accrue in those 2 studies. But researchers have also conducted 3 RCTs on the impact of education choice on academic attainment, so on graduation rates. All 3 found statistically significant improvements in graduation rates as a direct result of access to choice. And I'll just note, in Washington, D.C., we have a school voucher program in operation there. It had been under pretty severe threat for the past 8 years during the Obama years, but either way, the program's now on pretty solid footing. But that program in D.C., I would argue, is probably one of the only federal education programs that has ever really worked. But we found a 21 percentage point increase in graduation rates among participants in the D.C. Opportunity Scholarship Program, their voucher program there. And when I say we, it was the U.S. Department of Education who found that significant impact on graduation rates in D.C. And yet, we saw this program under threat for, like I said, the past 8 years, but it has since been put on solid footing, and we hope to see that expanded moving forward. So how does school choice create these fantastic, I would argue, impacts on academic achievement and attainment? It does it, I would argue, by putting decision-making in the hands of the people who have the contextual information necessary to know what works for children, and that's their parents, who are experts in their needs. School choice creates these benefits by also making providers responsive to parents. As Jason Bedrick has written, real accountability means being directly accountable to those who bear the consequences of your performance. School choice generally, and education savings accounts in particular, are about holding providers directly accountable to parents. And there's a good reason why this works out this way. It is because a private school is a community that orients itself around a common purpose. Private schools are often built around a belief system and even a code of conduct. Some private schools have a mission to provide education to students of a single sex, so all girls or all boys schools. Others organize around a certain pedagogy, Montessori education, for example. And some are designed to serve only children with specific special needs, such as schools that educate children with autism. Others still provide religious instruction that is at the core of their mission to provide perhaps a Catholic education. So private schools are communities that are built around a common belief system, intentional communities. Students are able to select into these schools because they are well matched to their individual needs. And we have long recognized that. This is something that Heritage has fought for since our founding in 1973. We have always advocated for parents to be in the driver's seat of their children's education. And we have also worked at the same time, and this often gets left out of the equation, to ensure that taxpayers actually have a voice when Washington tries to accelerate the education spending spree. And we are seeing progress. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing growth in choice. In 2000, there were just 4 school choice programs in operation across the entire country. And today, like I said, there are more than 60 in operation across the states. So there's been incredible progress over the past decade and a half. But that also means that the tenets of the debate have shifted a little bit. Of course, we still have to make the case for choice, for empowering parents, for moving from systems that resemble monopolies to systems that, as Milton Friedman said, allow families to be free to choose. But those who work on education also know that they are in the enviable position of debating not whether there will be school choice, but best practices in program design, discussions about the size and scope of these options, creating a friendly regulatory environment that allows a market of providers to flourish, and debates about whether families will use their choice at a single private school of choice or to completely customize their children's education. And that is a good problem to have. We have made major progress. My hope is that one day, in the not-too-distant future, we will marvel at the fact that we once assigned children to government-run schools, consigning the poorest to schools that were often failing and sometimes unsafe. That we will be astounded by the fact that at the same time technology and choice enabled Americans to have food and car rides and entertainment at the touch of a button on your cell phone, that at the same time an impoverished child in India could learn physics virtually from a tutor in England, that at the same time we had options like Khan Academy and K-12 Inc., that we still operated schools in a brick-and-mortar assignment-by-zip code model that moves children along in batches in a factory-type system, and that we assign children to those schools based on where their parents could afford to buy a home. I think soon we will marvel at that anachronism. But in order to ensure that children have access to the highest quality options that meet their unique learning needs, we have to rethink the problem of public financing of education and how those dollars are currently directed. Public funding, as I said earlier, does not have to mean government delivery of schooling. Indeed, we should, as Friedman proposed, separate the financing from the delivery of services. Instead of funding school systems, we should fund children and move toward policies where dollars follow the child to any education option of choice. Work to advance educational opportunity, though, cannot end at high school graduation, because the opportunities of even those children who are graduating at the top of their class are hampered. Their life and career goals are hampered by $1.3, going now on $1.4 trillion in outstanding student loan debt today. Higher education, defined broadly to include four-year colleges as well as career and technical education and other individual coursework, should equip students with new skills and knowledge, should do that. And it should do so without saddling them or taxpayers with significant debt burdens. If we get creative with the delivery of higher education, just as we have started to do in the K-12 realm, that's an entirely achievable outcome. Massive open online courses, MOOCs, are already beginning to compete with non-consumption. Elite institutions like Stanford and Harvard, and of course Hillsdale, are already offering some of the best academic content anywhere in the world online. You can learn to code, study statistics, delve into Western theology, take coursework on economics or game theory, and learn Mandarin. Higher learning is no longer confined to ivory-covered brick walls. It is online, anytime, anywhere, to anyone. Our job now is to help policy catch up with technology. Just a few figures on the higher ed situation at the moment. During the 1970-71 academic year, $16.5 billion, that's inflation adjusted to 2015 dollars, flowed from the federal government through a handful of federal student loan programs, $16.5 billion. Now, there are twice as many federal aid programs and $140 billion that we spend annually on just student loans and grants. It's about $240 billion when you include deductions and other grants. So during the 1992-93 school year, only 45% of full-year first-time undergrads used any form of federal student aid, 45%. By 2011, that figure had climbed to 73% of all students accessing federal aid. And now the federal government originates and manages over 90% of all student loans today. having nearly completely crowded out the private lending market. Has that made college more affordable? No. Consider this. During the 92-93 academic year, the inflation-adjusted sticker price of a four-year college was $3,998. That's inflation-adjusted to today's dollars, which had risen to $9,650 during the 2017-18 school year. That's a four-year public institution, 1 year, about $9,000 now. For a private nonprofit four-year institution, the sticker price was $17,800 during the 1992-93 academic year. Today, it's about $33,400 on average at a private institution per year. So no, dumping money out of helicopters, as economist Richard Vedder has said, onto universities has not encouraged them to keep costs in check. And the other problem is, attached to all of that aid are volumes of federal rules and regulations which have been increasing in size and scope over the decades. In order to keep college costs in check, then, we have to think about curtailing overgenerous federal lending policies in order to make space again for private lending. Importantly, federal loan forgiveness must also be eliminated, period. It's important, I think, to remember that only 1/3 of Americans today hold bachelor's degrees. So when the federal government is in charge of 90% of all student loans, then taxpayers bear the burden for loan forgiveness and for when students default on their loans. And of course, many of those taxpayers, like I said, do not have college degrees themselves. So it is a terribly inequitable way to think about how we finance higher education. We're shifting the burden of paying for college from the student, the person who directly benefits, to the 2/3 of Americans who don't have bachelor's degrees themselves. So how do we start to wind down this federal behemoth that exists in both K-12 and higher education today? I have three things that I would suggest. First, allow states to completely opt out of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So ESEA, remember this was No Child Left Behind just 2 years ago. Now we call it the Every Student Succeeds Act. States should be able to opt completely out. And they should be able to put their dollars toward any lawful education purpose under state law. I think that something that often gets forgotten in the conversation is that the federal government is just a 10% stakeholder in all K-12 education financing. So states and localities pay for 90% of everything that we spend. So allowing them to opt out and to put those dollars toward their local priorities should be a priority of Congress. And this is something that has taken legislative form over the past few years. It's the Academic Partnerships Lead Us to Success Act. We have seen it reintroduced a few times. And actually, during the height of the debate over the rewrite of No Child Left Behind about 1.5 years ago, A+ got consideration for the first time on the Hill. And it got 195 votes in the first effort ever to push that forward. And so now, A+ really is, I would argue, the conservative alternative to this large-scale federal intervention through ESSA. But in addition to allowing states to opt out, to putting their dollars towards state and local priorities, we should also think about, and this is where we have to be very careful, allowing the federal government to advance some school choice options. There are, I would argue, very few vehicles at the federal level that are appropriate or wise to use to advance education choice. If you put a program at the federal level, there could be myriad strings attached, and you want those programs situated as close to the students they will affect as possible. However, there are a few areas where the federal government actually has a constitutional warrant to advance an education choice option. And so thinking about modernizing the existing dollars that we spend in those areas and transitioning those dollars into education savings accounts is smart policy. One option would be the money that we spend right now for Native American children living on tribal lands. There is a unique contractual obligation with the federal government. We should modernize that funding and enable these children to exit what are arguably the worst schools in the country, Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. It's a tragic situation. So that would be one option. Another option, the District of Columbia is under the jurisdiction of Congress. And we could easily think about, and it would be entirely appropriate, transitioning the district into an all-choice district and enabling every single child in Washington, D.C. to choose whatever school works for them. But we should also, and this last point is one I'm very excited about on the federal school choice front, we should provide choice to children of military families. Children of military families sacrifice just as their parents sacrifice. And this is, at this point, a retention issue. We know that 35% of active duty families, active duty members, have thought about leaving military service altogether because of the public school their child would have to attend when they move to a new duty station. So this is a retention issue, but it's also a national security issue. We know that only about a third of Americans today who want to qualify for military service could do so, either because of a criminal background, lack of physical fitness, or their education level. So it has bearing both on the military today as a retention issue and on the future generations from whom we will be recruiting. So thinking about advancing choice for military-connected families is the third piece that we think is appropriate through federal policy. And finally, the last thing that the federal government really should do to start divesting itself from all of its various intervention from K-12 through higher ed is in the higher ed sphere, to make space for private lending and to think about accreditation reform. The federal government should extricate itself from higher education, and in order to create a private lending market that is actually responsive to students and to put downward pressure on higher education prices, federal loans and grants should be streamlined. Many of those loans should be outright eliminated in order to provide for a market of options that will better meet the needs of students. A traditional four-year bachelor's degree is the other critical piece of this puzzle. We have made it such through accreditation as it exists today that for many people, a traditional bachelor's degree is the only path that seems viable to upward mobility. And it's a great path, but it shouldn't be the only path for students. There are many students for whom alternative options, individual courses, could really provide them with the marketable skills needed to enter a career right off the bat. But that requires eliminating what has become a de facto federal system of accreditation and allowing individual options to accredit and credential courses, allowing Hillsdale to put its seal of approval on an individual theology class and allowing those student loans and grants to follow to an individual course, allowing the Mayo Clinic to certify a nursing course or Boeing to certify an aeronautical engineering course. So really infusing some market competition and options within the higher education realm, but that requires decoupling federal financing from accreditation. So those are the three big reforms that we see as really a prerequisite to eliminating or significantly limiting federal intervention in local school policy, allowing states to opt out of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, advancing school choice in the few ways that are appropriate, and making space for private lending through accreditation reform. So I'll conclude with this. There will never be, at the K-12 level, this is particularly true, there will never be a better advocate for a child than a parent, and there will never be a stronger form of accountability than parents who are empowered to vote with their feet when a school or an education provider does not meet their needs. Individuals must be free to choose so they can be free to learn. Education, as we've written, should prepare individuals to inherit the blessings and liberties of a free society. Curtailing government intervention in education at all levels and putting students and parents in the driver's seat can ensure that it does just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you.
Thank you so much for coming, Ms. Burke. The problem with implementing a school choice program is that as long as government funds are going to an individual program, the taxpayer and thus the state has an interest in how those funds are used. So, for example, near where I live, there's a Gulenist school, a school that's teaching based on a Islamic Turkish cleric. What would your solution be to situations where school choice programs are directing funds towards institutions that may not have the requisite ability to provide an education, or may be teaching things that serve to undermine the government of the United States?
Sure. So, great question. Thank you for that. I'll start with your last piece on this question of someone teaching something that would undermine the government of the U.S. No school is allowed to teach something like that. There are basic protections in place. So, I think on that regard, that choice really isn't an issue. Schools are not allowed to teach anything that would be subversive to the government. On the first point, though, or your middle point, I think that it is important not to compare education choice and what we hope it could provide with some utopian vision. I think it's much more important to compare it with what we currently have. What we currently have is a system that is failing thousands and thousands of kids every single year, and that is a system that I would argue is not accountable to anyone. I mean, point to, you can look at schools across the country, public schools, where reading proficiency rates in some instances are literally in the single digits, and kids are graduating. Find me the administrator who is held accountable for that, right? I mean, very rarely do we actually see accountability, and that's, of course, because we know that schools, district schools, get dollars no matter how well or how poorly they perform, and that is, again, because of that assignment by zip code system. So we know, at least from the literature, that choice does a better job than assignment by zip code. We know that parents, for the most part, have what's in their child's best interest and will fight to the very last breath to make sure that they're getting what works for their children. And, combined with choice options, I think we can expect to see some really wonderful outcomes as a result. But I would try to compare it to what we currently have versus what, some utopian vision of what it could be.
Thank you so much for coming out, Ms. Burke. It was really a pleasure to talk with you at dinner, and I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. As a native Arizonan, I'm very proud, as you mentioned, of the wonderful steps that Arizona has taken with school choice, especially as a homeschooler. And back in August, there was quite a bit of controversy over trying to expand the ESA program.
That's right.
And people like Senators Debbie Lesko took a lot of heat for trying to do this. And Save Our Schools Arizona, which is a parent-led coalition, was very much against this and trying to get petitions to stop and send it to the ballot. And I'm trying to understand, why are parents who have kids, especially those with kids in schools, why would they be against ESAs, and how do we communicate that it's actually in their best interest?
That's such a good question. So, how to say this? So I think that we should think about it as maybe not necessarily being representative of parents. Just as I would say, unions aren't necessarily representative of teachers, right? So unions tend to be representative of the union heads, and that's about it, right? The adults in the system. With some of these initiatives, I would say it's also the case with what are ostensibly parent-led groups, but are really special interest groups trying to stop choice from spreading. I think the unions, special interest groups in general, view choice correctly as an existential threat to their model, to their power in public education. And so they have tried at every turn to stop these options from proliferating. And you're absolutely right. In Arizona now, Arizona, as I mentioned, home to the first ever education savings account option, there is now a fight in Arizona, a ballot initiative that's underway to, long story short, repeal the expansion of the program that had been in place. The unions, of course, will dump tons of money in a way that most groups can't match into this ballot initiative, so it is in a pretty tenuous position right now. If the ESA option gets a bad ballot outcome in Arizona, it would only repeal the expansion. So the actual core program's still in place. Just quickly by way of background, when Arizona started their ESA in 2011, it was only open to kids with special needs. But it was super popular, so then they expanded it to military families, children of fallen soldiers, children adopted out of the foster system, Native American children, their siblings. So every year the program expanded to more and more eligibility pools. This past year, they expanded it to be a universal option. So every student in Arizona, if they wanted, could access an education savings account. And that is now what is under attack in that initiative. So we'll see what happens moving forward. I would just add that this has kind of been the story of education choice options, is that they tend to start small in the states. Families get a taste of choice, and then we see it expand pretty rapidly. One exception to that was Nevada. Nevada introduced an ESA option a couple of years ago now, and they started totally universal. It was amazing. It blew everybody away. They said every single kid in Nevada, if they want it, can have an ESA. 473,000 kids. There is currently also a legal battle playing out in Nevada, but we hope that that will end up well and will be really the first state with a widespread universal education choice option in place. But great question, thank you.
Sorry. Oh my gosh. Hi. Thank you for coming out to talk today. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Just it seems that you are intimating a desire for a significant shift from public school education to a diverse array of private education options. But I'm wondering if you could speak on the viability and prudence of greatly improving our public school education, just because, you know, the institutions were founded and advocated by our founders to educate the public at large. And so it just seems like there's a great disparity, and it would be prudent to improve that to make public schools a competitor to private educations, as opposed to just sort of shifting away from them entirely.
Yeah, great question. So to me, this all comes back to that Friedman-esque notion of just because we publicly finance it doesn't mean it should be government delivered. So yes, totally, publicly finance education, but just allow those dollars to follow a student to whatever works for them. So I wouldn't think about it at all as undermining our public education ideal. It's just a situation where we're deciding who's in a better position to steward those dollars. Is it a parent, or is it a bureaucrat who's never met the child who should be making those decisions? And I really believe that we will strengthen public education overall when we give some control to families. And we know this to some extent. We don't have a ton of evidence yet, but we know it to some extent with the academic literature that's out there on the competitive effects of education choice programs. So where we have seen school choice options come into existence and expand, the nearby public schools have upped their game, because they know that they can no longer just rely on a steady stream of students no matter how well or poorly they perform. And so what is beautiful about choice is that empirically it has improved the outcomes for both the kids who choose to stay in the district system and those who choose to exit the system. And I think that that's the other thing to remember too. You know, a family will only leave a public school, traditional public school, if it's not meeting their needs. And if it's not meeting their needs, I would argue we shouldn't trap them there. So if public schools are being responsive to families, providing options that work for them, nothing to worry about. But even beyond that, though, I think it does get back to your original question. It is just a matter of us reconceptualizing what public education means. What do we want to achieve through public education? We want an educated public. We want a public that is safe in school, that has civic values, that appreciates everything I mentioned before, the arts and learning generally, and is prepared to pursue a career, inherit the blessings and liberties of a free society. We want all of these things. So the question is, what's the best way to ensure as many students as possible can achieve those ends? And I would argue it's parents who are empowered to choose options that work for their children. Thank you.
So my question regards the idea of textbooks, because currently right now there's a lot of criticism about textbooks and how they're being created, at least with the curriculums, because typically it's the school board, state boards of California and Texas that drive what is in our in students' textbooks. So how can these initiatives help change like the kind of monopoly on what the curriculum is going to be taught?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I hope that that's an additional benefit that we see accrue from an education savings account model in particular. And I know I probably sound like a broken record talking about ESAs nonstop, but I genuinely believe that the power that that has to really alleviate a lot of these pressure points, textbooks being a really great example, but just debates generally about what's taught within a district system to which a child is assigned. But you know, you can imagine, and families are doing this. We know, by the way, about a third of families use their ESAs this way, where you are buying, as a parent, individual textbooks or just books in general. They don't have to be textbooks. You are finding curriculum that works. Maybe it's a great books curriculum. And then you were hiring private tutors. It was amazing. We were in Arizona again and watched a student, EJ was his name, about 8 years old, has autism. And he had been in a district school, and it was not working for him at all. He was having a terrible experience. And in fact, his family moved, I think from Michigan, incidentally, to Arizona to access the ESA option. And it was just so amazing to see EJ. He gets his, I think it was math the day that we showed up. The tutor comes to his home. It's a regular tutor who he got to know really well. She gives the math lesson. Mom pulls out her ESA debit card. The tutor pulls out her iPhone with the square thing on top of it. Mom swipes her ESA debit card, pays the tutor directly. EJ gives her a hug, and she's on her way. I mean, it's that type of customization. So I think whether it's textbooks or tutoring, whatever it ends up being, that families can pick down to the penny how they want to spend every single dollar. And I think that the benefits of that accrue to a lot of other areas where there isn't, to your point, a market. There's much more of a monopoly right now.
Hi, I'm Don Brimfield, and I'm from California. And I like what you're talking about in general. I think there's a bridge here, though, between the parents. I agree that parents should know the best thing and what they want for their kids. But we have a moral deficit in America, so I'm not always sure of that. But I do think that there's a lot of situations where, as Abraham Lincoln said, let's teach the children so we don't have to teach the adults. We didn't do that.
Yeah.
So now we have to teach the adults. So if you want to have a parent that can decide what's best for their children, we might have to start by having the parent and the child in the same academic educational setting for a while until the parent can pick up their education and then be able to know what's best for their children.
Right.
And I know that's difficult, but I live in a community where 4 miles away there's a very deprived, economically deprived situation. And some of those, probably 50% of those parents can neither read nor write very well. Maybe they can sign their name. And so how do they know what's best for their children? We don't always know, but I think there should be some basic, fundamental truths of fact in education that we want all schools to teach. And these people be brought up through that stream of thinking, and then they could be released maybe to make better choices for their children.
So that's a great comment. We get that comment a lot. I have lots of thoughts on that. The first is that choice, I would argue, will create a type of standardization that you're looking for in a way that we don't have it today. If you look at the charter school sector, that's a really good example of what I'm talking about. So just like you know, when you go to a Burger King, what a Whopper in Baltimore tastes like is what a Whopper is going to taste like in Texas. You know when you send your child to a KIPP charter school that you're getting a pretty solid education foundation. You're going to get roughly the same KIPP experience in New York as you do in Houston. And that isn't any sort of government mandate about what KIPP teaches beyond the annual testing. But beyond that, that is choice that has created a level of standardization that parents can then opt into. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. In terms of maybe Americans not being as up to snuff as you would like them to be generally, this is again the great thing about choice, right? It is that idea that I mentioned earlier on the competitive effects, but this, you know, to sound cliche, this rising tide that lifts all boats. I don't have to be an expert, and I am definitely not an expert in car buying. However, I can talk to my neighbors, I can look at reports, whatever car, Kelley Blue Book, whatever's out there, and get both expert feedback and peer-to-peer reviews about what a good car is. Same thing with restaurants when you go out. I don't look at the Michigan Health Department website when I go to find a restaurant. Maybe I should, I don't know. But I don't look at the Michigan Health Department website. I look at Yelp. and Urban Spoon, and I see what other people have said about a restaurant. How have they rated it? And in fact, interesting little side note on that, I believe it was New York, but it was difficult for the health inspectors to go around and rate all of these restaurants all the time consistently. And so they started crowdsourcing information from Yelp and from some of the restaurants that rate restaurants. And there was actually an academic study out on this, and that Yelp reviews predicted perfectly whether or not a restaurant would get a bad health inspection rating or not. And so I mention that just to say the types of nuanced information that a market will provide you will certainly accrue to education. I think we are just so used to 150 years, not quite actually, 100 years or so of government-delivered, government-assigned schooling that it's just really hard to break out of that mold. And we tried the standardization test with Common Core, and that was no good. Thank you.
I'm from Bowling Green, Ohio, and my state senator says that it's very likely that Ohio will pass an ESA in the next couple of years.
So.
In Ohio, as you mentioned, it's property taxes. I pay a local school income tax, and then there's money that comes from the state.
That's right.
If an ESA is 90% or even 100% of what the state spends, that's less than 50% in the district that I am. From your perspective, is that going to work, or is there going to have to be other sources of money?
Yeah. It's interesting you would bring that up. I actually wrote a paper on that exact issue for the Buckeye Institute in Ohio, because they are, in fact, looking at expanding an ESA model. And Ohio's home to quite a few existing education choice options as it is. And so, you know, y'all aren't new to the education choice model at all. There are different ways to think about it. That 50% of the state per pupil could be one funding source. If you want to get really crazy, you can think about a tax credit financed education savings account. So if you think about how a tax credit scholarship works, basically the output is like a voucher, but the input is an individual or a corporation contributing to a nonprofit. The donor gets a dollar-for-dollar tax credit, and then a student gets a scholarship to attend a private school of choice. The output in that case could be an education savings account. So you could even transition your existing education choice options into an ESA model as well. So I think there are a couple different vehicles you could pursue for making it viable, but it's tricky when you're in a state where most of your revenue comes from local property tax, but it's not without precedent entirely. Douglas County, Colorado has the only district-run school choice program in the country, which has been really interesting because it was their state school board that actually created this program in Colorado. So there are a few different vehicles that are out there for doing an ESA in Ohio. So I'll send you my report.
We have time for one more question.
I may be repeating myself here, but I really wanted to support Don Brumfield because I think with the, I can hold it, I think, okay. I believe that parents do know what's best for their children by and large, but there are, and many of the people who've taught school here certainly have understood that there are many, many parents who do not necessarily know how to help their kids. So I guess I just am seconding his comments and also the young woman in back about public schools. Do we really need to forget about public schools, or can we try to improve them too? And what you're saying, I'm not sure I understood exactly what you're saying about how they would be improved, but I hope that's the case. I hope that's being considered.
I think great notes to end on. So on the last piece of your question, if I had my druthers tomorrow, every single child in the entire country would be funded with an education savings account, and they could then choose any option. If they wanted to go to a brick and mortar district-run school, that would be wonderful. But if they needed something else, they could choose it. So that's how I would, if we were starting from scratch tomorrow, I would fund the kid instead of the physical plant that is the school building. But on the first part of your question about parents, maybe some having difficulty navigating a system of choice. So I'll give you one anecdote, and not data, but an anecdote from DC. So there's a great small private Christian school in DC, Cornerstone. And as I mentioned, DC has a voucher program. It's been there since 2003, only federally funded voucher program. And we talked to the principal at Cornerstone, and he said, you know, I know immediately, oh, and I should preface this by saying the DC voucher is open only to low-income families. So the median income was $23,000 for a family of 4 last year, which let me tell you, in DC is nothing. So these are the lowest income families, but the principal said, I know immediately when a parent from the DC voucher program is calling on the phone and looking for a school because they have a checklist of things that they want. That ability to shop around, they're asking all kinds of questions about the teacher, the curriculum, the pedagogy, extracurriculars, the religious instruction that's there, school safety. So he said he knows immediately when it's a voucher parent because they have this shopping around checklist. And this is one of my favorite quotes from an academic paper. Here I think that's safe to say, actually, that I have a favorite quote from an academic paper, not always safe. But one of my favorite quotes was from Patrick Wolf at the University of Arkansas. And he actually conducted the random assignment evaluations in DC of that program. And he said that what he found was that parents moved from being passive recipients of the public system to really active participants, that it moved them from the margins to the center of their child's academic experience. And that just, it really resonated with me, and it has been the experience we've seen on the ground. So, you know, yes, there will need to be some adjustment to a widespread system of choice, but I have every confidence that it will be far better in the long run than what we have now. So, great. Thank you.